Okay, hello, this is Dr. Tyrrell, and this is the business card grid design tutorial for document design English 319. What we're going to do is walk through some things about this aspect of the project, how to use some of the tools, that sort of thing. I'm just recording this live, so it's not going to be polished. I'm probably going to mess up a few things and then try and figure it out and then swear and then eventually figure it out. But that's how things are pretty much going to run. So for this project, we've got a few things to consider. We're going to be dealing with a limited space design. What that means is a business card is a small document, right? For us, it's set at 3.5 by 2 inches. So we're dealing with limited space, and that presents its own kind of rhetorical design challenges. It's also text-driven primarily. Business cards, as we can see from some of the examples on the project page, can be very tactile, very image-driven documents, but they are also very commonly text-driven documents. The idea is to transmit certain textual content. So we'll be thinking about how to design using text as the driving design object. We're also going to be looking at grid design. We read about grid design in our book. And grid design isn't necessary. It's not always deployed, but it is a structure that takes care of some of the design principle issues that we've been encountering. So things like alignment, order to an extent, arrangement, these sorts of things can be handled through a grid structure. And it tends to be very functional. Of course, part of that is also knowing when to violate grid structure, when it wouldn't be appropriate, that sort of thing. We're going to be getting some exposure to grid design through this project. And then also, we know we have to incorporate a specific element, and we'll look at the project page here in a second. But in particular, we're talking about a QR code, and we'll look at what that is, but it's a specific visual element we'll be incorporating. So we know that design object has to be in there. We're going to be using Adobe InDesign as a primary design tool. You don't have to use that. You can use other stuff. InDesign is, because it's a typesetting program, it's pretty well set up for this kind of thing, text-driven. It also is very good at setting up grids kind of on the fly or in a fluid way. Has a lot of flexibility with that. You can always build grids in other programs, but this, you can just sort of tell InDesign how many you want, and it'll just do it for you on the fly. So that's what we're going to be using. Let me just close out that. So let's take a look at our project page. It's a good place to start. Here's the home page. So if we go to projects here and digital presence project, that's what we're turning to. We know what we have to do, right? We have to make a business card, as it says, a QR code enhanced business card. And it gives us a set size, 3.5 inches by 2 inches. It does not set the orientation, portrait or landscape. Business cards are commonly landscape, but not always. So we'll look at that. It also points out that we'll be making a web page that will connect to this QR code. QR codes, as we'll see, they are print or at least tangible objects, but they can be accessed by digital technologies, most commonly smartphones, and they can link to websites or transmit particular data. So we'll be designing a corresponding web page. We're not going to cover that in this tutorial. We'll have another tutorial about the web page. But as the project page points out, in order to do this, we're going to be inventing hypothetical businesses. And we will be completing design plans, but we do need to make up some kind of business, purely hypothetical, just for the purposes of constructing a corresponding business card and profile web page. So that's the gist of it. It does point out how these things are going to be delivered, and we'll talk about this more in class, but ultimately our business card will be delivered as a press quality PDF file. The profile web page, let me just eliminate that confusion right there. This is one of those mistakes I mentioned earlier. The web page will actually be uploaded to our student web space. You may not know this, but just by being a student, you have web space. We'll look at how to upload stuff to that, how to make it accessible on the open internet. Not in this tutorial, but in the future. So for our business card, we kind of get the gist of it. We've got a set size. We know we need a hypothetical business, and we know we need a QR code. We've probably not worked with those before. Maybe you have, but probably most of us have not. So what is a QR code? If we scroll down here to our resources section, the Wikipedia entry gives a good overview. This is what one looks like, and you've probably seen these before, or if you haven't, you've probably walked by them. They're sort of like barcodes. That's one way to think of them, is that they're like barcodes. And as you know, anything you buy that has a barcode on it, there's a reader at the checkout that can scan that barcode. And what it's doing is taking that graphic image and transforming it into digital data. In the case of a 2D barcode, it's basically just a string of numbers. That's all that can communicate, basically. A QR code is much more data rich. It can communicate a lot more data. So just, the amount of numbers or text or whatever is just larger. And it can also transmit different kinds of data, whereas a 2D barcode just does a string of numbers commonly. QR codes can, as we're using them, transmit a web address so that they can automatically forward a smartphone to a corresponding website. They can transmit V-card data. That's electronic contact cards. So, if you have a Rolodex type thing on your smartphone, it can be populated by V-card data. It can transmit text. It can transmit lots of different kinds of data. So it's just a lot more flexible than something like a barcode. It also can be constructed. It is a physical thing usually. I mean, you can scan one that's digital, of course. All it really needs to be is this picture. So you can construct it, just out of print, out of a screen, or out of tangible objects. That sounds kind of kooky, but we'll look at some examples here, right? So what are these good for? I mean, what do people use them for? Here under QR code uses on our resources page, I've got some links, but here's some examples. Wikipedia basically has tied all of its entries to corresponding QR codes. So that means you can take these codes and embed them in different places, and they will link to the corresponding Wikipedia page. So this town, I believe it's Monmouth, it's Welsh, so I don't exactly know. They sort of jumped on this bandwagon and embedded over 1,000 real-world QR code plaques onto physical spaces. So here you can see this is Shire Hall, and it just has this QR code. Tourists or whoever can scan these codes with their mobile devices, and it will automatically link to a corresponding Wikipedia page that gives information about what they're seeing. That's through what's called the QRpedia project. They also pop up in advertising. There are ways to deliver coupons. So this, for example, is Macy's Backstage Pass. You may have seen this a year or two ago. You'd get a print coupon, or they'd be in the store and you could scan them and they'd have specific deals. And why this would be different than a print coupon is it could be revolving, right? You could go in there, scan the same code, but the data it linked to could be changed. So for example, it could go to the exact same website address, but the information on that website could have been updated. So, this hour we have a sale on shirts. Next hour you come scan and it's going to be a sale on pants or something like that. They're also sort of, advertising, everything works its way into advertising, but there are some sort of high stakes medical reasons QR codes are getting deployed. Things like, those life alert bracelets, those are limited in terms of data transmission by what can fit on the face of that bracelet, right? So maybe something like, I have a penicillin allergy, or I'm diabetic, or something like that. If you could embed just a QR code that could be scanned by a paramedic and it linked to a full medical history, that's easy. That could be trivially done, and it's also super cheap. You don't have to build a special computer chip to wear around. All you have to do is print the QR code and wear it around, a bracelet or a neck. That's one thing that separates QR codes from similar technologies like NFC, near field communication. If you've ever paid for anything with your phone just by, bumping it against a a machine at a cash register that probably uses NFC, or RFID, that's a radio frequency interface device, I think. That's similar. Both of those require special chips. Now, RFIDs are super cheap. NFC is still not that cheap. I mean, it's cheap enough, but none of them can compare to the cheapness of a QR code. I mean, you don't even need to print it out. You can just draw one. Relatedly, some medical deployments are things like, this is one that's patched, or it works with Google Glass, so doctors can wear around their Google Glass when they just look. They don't even have to scan. They just look at the printed QR codes that can be inserted into the frames by the door here. It can just pull up a full medical history of the patient in there. So QR codes aren't like going to take the world by storm. They're doing their job now. In the United States, they really haven't exploded the way they did in other countries. So it's not as though we need to jump on this bandwagon because it's taking off for the stars. It's always going to be this kind of niche technology, but it's probably also going to keep a pretty strong hold on that for a while because it's super flexible and it's super cheap. You can just print it out, throw it away, print out another one when someone else checks into this hospital room. You can't do that if you have to make a special computer chip every time, right? But this is just super cheap. And with the ubiquity of things like smartphones, it's easily accessible. No one carries around a barcode reader, but everyone has a smartphone now. This was a weird deployment. This is one in a gravestone. So you could actually scan at a person's grave site and connect to something like an online memorial where people would leave reminiscence. And this sort of shows the flexibility of QR codes here. This is not print. This is actually a three-dimensional sculpture. And when the light gets right above it, it casts these shadows, and these shadows form the actual QR code, right? See how this looks just like this? You don't even need to print it out. The camera just has to be able to recognize these black shapes, and that counts. So you can embed these in all kinds of different ways cheaply. So that's the gist of what QR codes are. For our purposes, they're going to be on our business card. People will be able to scan them with smartphones, and they'll link to a corresponding web page. We're focused on the business card right now. So let's get down to it. I've already been going like 10 minutes. As I said, we're using Adobe InDesign. Pardon me. You can use other tools. I mean, anything that can edit images, you could always just build a grid on a separate layer. But that's a little labor intensive. You can't change it on the fly. Certain Adobe tools, including InDesign, have really easy grid systems built into them. So what we're going to do is, I've just launched this. This is the screen you get. Sorry, my voice is cutting in and out. I'm not going through puberty. And it's going to come up with a default for letter sized, right? This looks a little intimidating, but let's just walk through kind of what's being said here. It's asking the number of pages. We just need one. Facing pages, that's always clicked by default. That means, like in a book, how there are two facing pages and their headers and footers are slightly different on the right and left. The recto or verso, that's right and left in publishing terms. We're not using 2 pages, so we can just uncheck that. It's not going to hurt anything one way or another, but there's no point in having it. We don't need an 8.5 by 11 page. We could use that and then just design a 3.5 by 2-inch square business card, and that is what we're doing, 3.5 by 2. But that would get a little complicated with the grid system. So I actually want to just go ahead and change the dimensions to what I'm going to use. And I'll put 3.5 here, oops, and 2 here. And the orientation isn't going to matter too much, but we are going to leave it here in landscape because that's what we're doing. Number of columns. Now this is just for the page itself, not grid columns. We're not dealing with that just yet. So 1 is fine. The gutter is not going to matter because it's just 1 column. And as we know from our book, a gutter is what comes between columns. It's the white space. So if there's 1 column, there's not going to be a gutter anyway. The margins. Now, for this, if you had 1/2-inch margins on something this small, your design area is going to be tiny. And it's going to be a tiny window. In fact, let me just show you that really quick, and then we'll see what that looks like. Yeah, so that's it, and that's the margin. That's not going to work. that dog won't hunt. So let's go ahead and actually just remove the margins completely. It's not going to be a big deal in the end, and it'll be a better representation of what we're doing with, or what we're dealing with. So one column, no gutter, and we're just going to take these margins off. When you put 0, it automatically will connect because this little lock thing is checked. So that all looks good. 3.5 by 2, one column, because we're not talking grid columns just yet. We're talking, that's the page. No margins, that all seems fine. So bam, there we are. Let me zoom out just a hair. This is our artboard, this sort of white space. This pink line thing is our actual page. 3.5 by 2. You can see the ruler, in fact, so 0 to 3.5, 2 inches. That's how we know. If you don't have the ruler, you can turn that on under show rulers and hide rulers here, but I want to have it on. So our first step is probably to build our grid system. Now we know from our book, grids, they have a balance of tension in terms of the content inside, which exerts internal pressure on the grid structure, and the grid itself, which exerts external pressure on the design objects. What that basically means is you kind of have to adjust the grid to fit the design objects that you're going to be using. And then the grid itself will then control or corral how those things can be structured. So you can't have, a grid that's too large or too small for the stuff that you're going to be including and for the document itself. Let's look at that in practical terms. I'm going to build our grid. And in InDesign, the easiest way to do this is here under layout. It's perhaps a little confusing because you'd think maybe view, guides, and grids. Well, heck, why don't I just turn on the baseline grid? Because this looks like a note card. This is not exactly what we want. We want to build our own grid, so I'm going to turn that off. We go to layout, confusingly, and create guides. That's what we're actually building, is a guide. That's kind of separate from the built-in grid that this software is using. So create guides, and we get this little window, and you can kind of see some of the terminology that we've already covered in our book and in class. Things like gutter. Technically, one's a gutter and one's a flow line, but the good thing is this gives us in both rows and columns a way to set the number and the white space or gutter between those rows and columns. Options fit it to the margins or to the page. We want to go ahead and use the page. We don't have any margins anyway. This we don't need to check unless we've already got a grid system that we need to change, remove existing guides. We don't. You do want to check this preview thing, because otherwise when you start doing stuff here, it's not going to show you anything, right? You'd have to sort of just do it in your head. But why bother when you can just click preview and it'll automatically start showing you things, right? So for example, right now we've got no rows, no columns. I'm going to want to build rows and columns, and it's going to have to be appropriate for the stuff we want to include. So, let's just say, what about 3 rows here? I've got 1, 2, 3, and my gutters are 0.1 repeating 6. And those are pretty big gutters, right? I mean, this is a tiny little business card. If you have gutters that big, it's just a whole lot of white space, and that means you can't design there. Well, you can, but you do it intentionally because you'd be violating the gutter. So that's the first thing I want to do, is really tweak down this gutter. And if you click down, it's going to give you presets. And those can be pretty good, right? It does sort of metric fractions. So it goes, 0.25, and then it just scales down sort of fractionally. So this 0.0625, that's probably going to be good, right? I mean, it's a nice narrow enough one. If you click it again, it goes to 0. So if you want them smaller than that, you can do it. You just have to type it. So like, 0.03. See, and those are tiny. Those might be too small. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at this. And if I have to change it later, I can do that. That's the good thing. But with 4 rows, that only gives me a couple of places to put things. That probably isn't going to work. Building the number of rows and columns is important, because you might think, well, we've only got a few lines of text and a QR code, so why don't we just make a grid of 9 or something like that. If you do that, it ends up very grid driven, right? I mean, it looks like a tic-tac-toe board. So that can be limiting. keep in mind that you don't have to just design in cells themselves. Like if I put 4 columns up here, and you'll notice the gutters don't have to be the same size. I'm going to make them the same size just for tidiness. But you don't just have to design in cells. You can design across multiple cells. But what you want to do is use these gutters as sort of your barrier, right? We saw in our book that you don't just design in cells. This gives you, I could put one thing that covers these 2 cells, and then something below it that covers 3, and then something over here that's in this cell. So you don't just stay within the cells. What that means is you don't have to have this kind of tic-tac-toe or plaid setup. It's usually a good idea to have more columns and rows. If you have too many, then it loses the point of having a grid. It's just open space. So you want to have a balance there. I'm actually going to put in a few more than this. I'm going to try and think of a number here that's divisible by a few different things, because if I want to use the half of the page, I'd like to have it divisible by 2. Did I say divisible? I can't edit this. Just pretend I said the right thing. And I also might want to think about having something divisible by 3. 2 and 3 is a good thing. That gives you some flexibility there, because then you can deal in halves or thirds. So I'm probably going to go ahead and build, since rows is going to be, this is the shorter side, right? I'll build, let's say, 12 of these. That's pretty well in there. I might shrink my gutter just a hair, because right now it's pretty well packed in there. So let's do 0.5. Yeah, now there's more delineation between them. And I'm probably going to raise my columns here to, let's say, 15. And I can come back and change this later. But even with this this looks like maybe a lot of cells, but this will give me some structure and flexibility that I wouldn't have without a grid. It handles alignment and placement and that kind of thing. If I need to change this, I'll come back later. I could scale this down to something like 9 even, or 10. And we can try it that way. Yeah, and we'll do this because I can always come back and change it. This also shows that the cells don't have to be the same size. Okie doke. So one thing I might want to tweak is, I know my QR code has to be square. I know that going into it, so I want to think in my head about the internal pressure. What's going to be about square? Right, so maybe 12 by 12 would be a good one, because then, I could do maybe like that, and that would be about square, or maybe down here. Would 15 fit better? Let's try it, and I can always come back and fix it. So I've built my grid here, and one thing to be aware of is you can still select these lines, and you don't want to do that accidentally, right? Because if I accidentally click and drag, it's going to move my line. What you probably want to do once you've built the grid is, so you don't accidentally select things, just select these, the whole thing. I just drag here, and then go to Object and Lock Position. You can still select stuff, but you can't move it or change it. It's locked, so there's no danger of messing up your grid. Okay, so we've got our grid. We know the QR code has to be in here, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So we might think about those numbers when we're building. So how the heck do we get a QR code? We actually have a link on our project page to a QR code builder. This is one that's accessible online. There are tons of these. You can just Google for QR code builder or something like that. This is just one that I use. And you can see there's all different kinds of information that can be transmitted. Plain text, a phone number, an SMS message, a geolocation, a Wi-Fi password, e-event or vCard stuff, all different kinds of data. So you can see why QR codes are so flexible. You can see they can be on shirts and mugs, and there's a business card. Yeah, I should just show you this and say, there you go, just do that. We're going to be using a URL. It's actually going to connect to our the web page we build, but we haven't built our web page yet. Not to worry, we'll just use a dummy code, and then later we can swap in our actual URL for this one. So I'm just going to put a dummy code here. And whoops, did I hit cancel? You can always just, copy and paste something like this. I'm just going to write one in here. So go to Google. It'll give us this live preview. Now I can download this. And notice it asks size, but that's only relevant if we're talking about raster graphics, right? PNG or JPEG, we talked about that. When we're dealing with vector graphics like SVG or EPS, size isn't an issue because it's resolution independent. It can scale without any loss of quality. So the size thing doesn't really matter because we're going to be downloading this as SVG or EPS. EPS is the one we're picking. That means encapsulated postscript. You don't have to know much about this, but you remember when we read about type, when it mentioned postscript as a technology, that's what this is. It's basically a vector format. Border, error correction code. You can change the colors, right? Foreground and background if you want. You can actually change this to something else if you're using color on your business card, or you can leave it as black. And I mushed that up. There we go. You can change the background too. Really, the reader just has to be able to differentiate between the foreground and the background. So black-white is obviously highest contrast. That's what we're doing. All right, so I'm downloading it. It's a tiny file, so that'll take a few seconds. It's already done. It's set to download to my desktop. So there it is. In InDesign, if we want to import an image, what we do is we actually go up to Place under File. That seems a little strange, but that's where it is. It's File Place. Just think of you're placing an external file onto your page here, your document. So desktop, EPS. It asks, do I want to replace the selected item? That means if I've got something already selected, I can just swap it out. I'm not doing that. And show import options. I'll show you those, although we're not going to change any of them. It's going to ask some things that'll be confusing to us. So at this point, we don't really even need to bother with this, and we don't want to rasterize it because we want to keep it in a vector format. So I imported it, and now you'll see nothing happened. What did happen was my cursor changed. You can kind of see that it now has this black square. That's actually a very small thumbnail of the QR code itself. When you place something and you don't replace something else, that little checkbox we didn't select, it basically just loads into the cursor. So all I have to do is click anywhere, and there it is. I can drag it around and whatever. This is tiny, but it's a vector, so I can scale it without any degradation of quality. I'm going to go ahead and do that because I could use a small QR code depending on how I wanted to set this up. I could use a small QR code on my business card, have name, maybe phone number, website, and then this. That's certainly a way to go. For our purposes, I just want to show you some different alternatives. So I'm going to make this a large primary feature of this design object. Depending on the hypothetical business you invent, maybe if it's something in the tech field or professional writing, since that's our course, you may want to highlight the fact that you're savvy with different technologies. So you may make something like your QR code a more prominent display object. I mean, for example, I didn't have business cards for a long time. I had CDs that I'd give people, and they had samples of my work and that kind of thing. This is before CD drives died off. Or some people, it's a little more expensive, would use flash drives, that would have information on it. This is a very cheap way to do kind of the same thing. It can link to an online portfolio rather than including the data. So for scaling, I can just click the corner here and just literally drag. Now, you'll notice when I move my mouse, it starts to shear, right? I can make it squished this way or this way. And if I do that, the QR code actually isn't going to look right. See, and that may not read because it's expecting a square. So I don't want to do that. I want to make sure this is going to scale correctly. I can do that under Object Transform Scale, and you can do it numerically. Right here, I could click 200 and it'll show me that. I'm not going to do that because I want to fiddle with the margins a little bit. So I'm just going to click and drag. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to press down Shift. Boop. And then when you press down Shift, it maintains the aspect ratio. No matter where I move my mouse, it locks it into this same square that the QR code is. You see that? A lot of Adobe programs do that. If I let go of Shift, it does this. If I press down Shift, it locks into this square. So I'm going to make this a large part of this design. I'm going to go ahead and move it out to here. And you can see this almost precisely fits our grid, which is great. We're going to need to futz with it a little bit anyway because, as you can see, the blue border here, it doesn't actually start where the code itself starts. It's where the sort of imaginary border is. So I've let go of my mouse, and you can see I made this square larger, but hey, the code isn't any larger. What is that all about? What happens in InDesign is when you scale something, you're basically just changing what's called its bounding box. What I can do then is when I right-click, and you probably saw this a second ago and you were wondering what the heck was going on. Here under Fitting, it'll ask, do I want to fit my content to fit this frame? Or do I want to fit this frame to fit the content? Or do I want to center it, right? Fit it proportionally, fit it, all these different kinds of options. What that is asking is, do I want to scale the content to fit this bounding box I've now drawn? Or do I want to shrink that bounding box to fit the content? Now we're wanting to make this thing larger. So I'm going to select Fit Content to Frame, and it's just going to automatically scale to fit that line I drew. Now, as I mentioned, you can see that the actual place where the QR code starts is a little bit behind the bounding box. Do you see what I'm saying? Let me scale in. There's a little bit of white between the border here and this. Now that's going to be a little goofy. I'm not going to change it right now. I just want us to be aware of it, because if I start designing in other rows and I'm using this as my top, margin or border, it's not going to match up precisely. So I'm going to have to fiddle with it just a little bit. That's not a big deal. And I'll do it afterwards just to sort of show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's start designing. We've got our QR code plopped in. The other thing to bring up is this looks, very, it looks like it's got this grid on it. I mean, is this what it actually looks like? No, what we're seeing is the design view. If you go up here to View, where it says Screen Mode, Normal is the design view. So it shows you all these different guides, the grids, everything like that. If I want a mock-up of what this would look like printed right now, I can just select Preview. That's what it looks like. You tend not to design in Preview because you want to see those boxes in that grid. This is just a quick look at a print mock-up. So let's switch back to normal. And okay, so we know this is a business card. It's going to have a hypothetical business. It should have my name and contact info. So let's start dealing with text. I just clicked on the text thing. It looks like a T. And text in InDesign, because this is a typesetter, it's handled through boxes. I can just click anywhere, well, anywhere on the artboard, and start drawing a box. And that's going to be the bounding box for this text. So I'll go ahead and do this, and I can always change it a little bit later. And let's just put, my name. And I tend to use J. Tyrrell. It's just an affectation. Now I'm going to go ahead and click this arrow over here, and I can move this box around, so I can move my text around. Watch what happens when I change the bounding box too. Boop. See, it automatically hyphenates because the bounding box is where the text can go. I'll put it up here so it's aligned with my QR code. Now it's not precisely aligned yet because, as we know, there's a little bit of a white space margin here, but we'll fix that. I don't want to use Times New Roman, so I'm going to go ahead and click on this. I'm going to look at the character palette. You can find that under Window and type in tables and then character. There's all these different little panels, so it can be a little confusing. I'm going to use something sans serif because that's more closely associated with the screen, and I want to communicate rhetorically my facility with digital technology. Trebuchet is a good standby. I'm going to bump up the font size. And as we know from our reading about fonts and type, technically every size of a font is its own font. So 12-point Trebuchet is a different font from 14-point Trebuchet. In the old days, it's because you'd have to build the actual letters, each one. And you can see how crazy large that would get, in the sense of if I wanted one font, I'd have to have one, alphabet in both upper and lowercase and all the punctuation at every possible size. Okay, think of that, one font. Then I'd have to have more for italics, right? Another, double that for all possible sizes. I mean, it was crazy. That's why having more than one font is relatively new, because, I mean, just think of the storage alone. It would take a warehouse to hold a couple of fonts. And those places still exist, actually. So I'm going to bump it up here to a larger size. I'll get moving a little more rapidly because I don't want this tutorial to take forever. You can see what happens when I start making it too large and it goes outside my bounding box. It starts to hyphenate. I can just change the bounding box and it'll fill in there. And this looks like a good size. We've got 30 there. And let me show you this. So this is the bounding box, and just like the picture, the text can be oriented in a lot of different ways. I'm going to right-click on it and go to, what are the text frame options? Yes. I did not swear, but I did get a little lost. And you can see it asks you, where do you want to position the text, right? Do you want this aligned at the top? Most of this you don't have to deal with too much. It has to do with spacing and columns and such. But this vertical justification, do I want it at the top? Do I want it in the center, right? And see, if I do that, it's not going to be aligned on the grid. Actually, it is, but that's just a shocking coincidence. Or do I want it at the bottom, right, where it's not aligned on the grid? I'm going to go ahead or justified, which means spaced out throughout the entire bounding box. I want it aligned at the top so that I know exactly where it's going to be. I also know here in paragraph that it's left flush. You can also, do right flush and center. I want it left flush, or left justified is what that technically is. Okay, so here's what we've got with our font. Now, a couple of quirks. You can see how it is aligned up at the top here with our grid. Let me zoom in a hair. Although it's not exactly, it's not touching the actual thing, is it? Now, if you want to get super fiddly, you can. I can change this. I can do something like this is a baseline shift, I believe. Yeah, and as we know from our reading, what that means is how shifted this text is going to be from the baseline. And you can do this on a character by character way, I guess. So for example, if this was going to be the first line or the first letter in like the first page of a book, I may want to baseline shift this way up and have it much larger, right? You can see it's 8 points up. I'm going to go ahead and put this back down to 0. I'm going to be dealing with the whole thing, so I'm just going to click the whole thing, and I'm going to shift its baseline. Oh, well, that's a good question, because as we can see, the L's are touching. So we have kind of two things going on here. Do you remember from our reading what ascenders are and things like the X height? This is where it comes into play, because the question is, what do I want to touch? The J and the T, and then have these things as ascenders? I can do that by clicking up the baseline. Ooh, and I might have to do a fractional baseline. Let me see if it'll, yeah, let's try 0.6. Oh, that's money. But notice that the tops of the L's are ascenders, right? They're going above. And the X line's actually down here. This is the cap height. Do I want that, or do I want the L's to touch? Either's defensible. I might keep it like this just because then the initial, the J and the T, are actually touching the grid. So I might keep it like that. But before we even futz with this, let's just put it back to 0, because right now our font is actually bleeding outside of our grid anyway. A grid's not just about alignment, it's also about positioning. So if we wanted to get strict and make sure that this is actually fitting in the grid itself, I'm going to go ahead and tweak down the font so that this starts to fit. Okay, so now it is resting on the baseline. It appears to be the J is. It's not quite reaching the top, so we can't do a baseline shift, because if we did that, say it's going to go up, but it's going to be shifting off the baseline, right? So what do? We can actually do this, which is a vertical scale. What that's going to do is, as it sounds, stretch it just a little bit vertically. Watch what happens when I click this up a hair. See how it's just stretching? 2%, 103%. Now it's touching, right? Just with a little touch of the vertical scale. And you can see how crazy fiddly you can get with this. Do you remember when you read about stuff like kerning and leading and tracking? These are all in here, right? Right now, for example, I have my kerning, that's this one. It's set to metric. That's computed by Adobe InDesign. I can also set it to optical, see, and it looks slightly different. What that means is it's now kerned. The letters are basically touching each other or not touching each other. Their relationship is based on an optical or to the eye viewpoint versus a metric or mathematical calculation. It's either slightly different. This is calculated by metrics. This is calculated optical, so how it should look to the eye. That doesn't necessarily mean optical is always better. I mean, there's a certain precision in the mathematical one, but these are the choices you make as a designer, right? What are you going to go with here? And usually consistency is a good thing. If you're going to do optical for one, you probably should do optical for all of them. You see how in optical, something like the E, it starts to rest underneath the stroke of the R a little bit more than if it was handled mathematically. You can also, if you're out of your mind, do this yourself. You can start to set your own kerning and tracking. Sometimes you have to do that just for a couple of particular letters to make them fit here and there and that kind of thing. But otherwise, it's better to let the machine handle kerning either the metric or the optical option. Then InDesign will take care of that for you. You can see we've also got some other crazy font options or some type options we might have to address, because even though now it's vertically perfectly within our cells, right? This is one cell, a gutter, and then another cell. It doesn't stretch all the way to this edge, does it? And if I change the font size to make it larger, it's just going to start popping out of here, right? If I bump, we're at 28. If I bump this up, it's just going to start expanding all directions. So I need some way to make this fit all the way over to this edge if I want to be super, super grid driven. And I do, because that's the point of what we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is move this over a hair so I can get a better look. There's a couple of things I can do. One is I can handle tracking. We looked at that in our book and we talked about it. Tracking, and it's set at 100 right now, it's like kerning, except kerning only deals with individual relationships between two letters. Tracking handles, and tracking is this one. Tracking handles the separation between all of the letters as a unit, generally in a word. Right now it's set at 0. Watch what happens if I click this up to, let's say, 25. You see how everything's spaced out? That means there's now extra, it's measured in fractions of an m, thousandths of an m, and m is a unit of measurement. You don't necessarily have to know that, but it is in document design. We use measurements like an m, picas, points. You drive yourself nuts. The reason why is because they're very, very small. You're dealing with very, very small stuff. And so inches is just way too big. Even centimeters is way too big. You don't need to know that right now anyway. So you can see what happens with the tracking. If I put this at 0, that's its normal one. If I expand it, it starts to separate. You can also crowd them together with negative tracking, right, if you have to do that. So that's one option. The other option is what's called the horizontal scale. We use the vertical scale to click it up to 103. Just to stretch it a little bit. You can do that horizontally as well. It does, as we'll see, tend to make things look a little chunky. Let's see. So there's 110, and we're almost at it, right? We can click this up. 110 is about as close as we can get because 111 pushes too far. but it does make it look a little chunky. It fattens it up. It looks kind of bold, you know. So we could do that, or we could do tracking, or we could do a combination of each. I'm going to do a combination of each just so you can see how that works. I'm going to bump the tracking up. Let's look at 10. Okay, so that's not too far apart, right? Let's start bumping up our horizontal scale. And it's just over. I wonder if I could change this to 9. Yeah, that's perfect grid alignment right there. Oh, except this is a little, I'm going to stretch this out a little bit so that that J actually touches the line. And you can see what I'm doing here. These are the acts of a madman. But that's the business of design, you know, getting into these little finicky things. And now you can see, because I shifted it over a little bit, this has gone a little bit this way. So I'm going to have to start tweaking up the tracking again, or making it a little bit more robust. Let's bump this up to 5. 6 is too large, so let's bump our tracking up to 11. Make it 12. And 13, and let's call it a day. Yeah. So there, perfect grid alignment. We have our L's rising above here. And if this drove you crazy, you could actually change this by changing these letters. Oops. Okay. There we go. You could change the L's. I'll show you on one L. Click down its percentage, right? And now it does fit. You're actually changing the shape of the font. These are the kind of insane things you get into when you're actually dealing with the fine points of design. I'm going to keep the L like that. I'm going to change this other one to match, because that is getting, I am obsessive and compulsive enough that that's bothering me. So there, perfect, perfect. We've got my name. As we mentioned now, the grid here, or excuse me, the QR code here, the bounding box is right now meeting the appropriate line, the gutter line, but the actual image itself doesn't. So if we look at how that appears in print, see, they don't quite match. You can tell. That's going to bother you. So let's go ahead and go back to our normal screen mode. I'm going to scale this up. Do I want to scale, or do I want to move it? I'm just going to move it up. I'm just going to click. Perfect. I'm going to click over. Perfect. Do you see now how the actual black and white, well, I guess just the edges of the QR code are in perfect sync with the line? Ooh, there's a little bit down here that's slopping over, isn't it? Well, we can't have that. So I'm going to scale this in just a hair. I'm going to hold down my shift. Yeah. Let's see what that did. I'm going to have to fit it. Ooh, that did way too much. So let's scale this in just a hair. And fit our content. And this is the last time I'm going to try this. You could do it, but I don't want to spend another 40 minutes doing this during your tutorial. You're probably already hitting the fast forward if you're still listening. So fit content to frame, almost perfect. I'm not going to let that drive me insane. I'm going to click it down just a fraction here. Where's my Alt key? There we go. Okay. And I don't want that. That actually copied it over, and I didn't want that. Perfect. Okay. So now when we look at it in preview, perfectly lined up, right? Perfectly lined up. All right, so let's go put some other information here. Let's just finish up this card, because I'm sure you're going insane right now. What else do we want? We want my, I don't know, my, we want what I do. Okay, so I can tighten up this. I'm going to go ahead and copy this over. I'm just going to copy and paste it. Line it up. Now we know from our reading that we should have an information order here, right? The most important stuff should be more prominent, and then it should scale down. So what I do is going to be smaller. I'm going to go ahead and just click on this. I want to make sure it's, let's go ahead and fix our character stuff, because it's got a lot of tweaks to it. I'm going to go ahead and put it back to normal. Yeah, that's all normal. I want to go ahead and line it up on a grid, and the gutter gives us a perfect break, right? Because it's built into our grid structure. So there's that. I'm going to want to change the size, keep the font, but let's scale this down to, let's say, 24, probably even less. Oops. And let's change this to my fake job. Professional, whoa, writing consultant. I may have misspelled that because I can't see. Yeah, and see, it's hyphenating. You don't want that. You know what I probably want is yeah. Although if I'm going to use 2 lines, what I really should do is use 2 different frames. Yes, let me just put that down here. I'll deal with you in a minute. Let's just go ahead and quickly deal with the grid alignment of this. So let's see, we have text frame options. We know it's at the top, fantastic. It does need to go over a little bit. So I can either, I'm going to zoom in here. I can either change its spacing, although I find it easier just to do this. I'm going to drag that over. Now it's doing a snap to grid. Yeah, let me see if I can just transform it. Yeah, it's perfect. All right, so now it's lined up with our grid. It's right at the top, it's right at the left. We have a couple of descenders, but that's fine. I mean, what are you going to do, clip a G? It's fine. So what I could do is, if I wanted to, I could have this actually expand out to meet this same text, right? If I wanted to, we know how to do that now. So I could finagle the width a little bit chunkier, a little bit farther. Yeah, it looks like if I mess with the tracking too much, it's going to get very far apart. So let's make it a little bit thicker. Ooh, too thick. Let me move over so we can see this. Perfect. So that's one way to handle it. Now, it doesn't have to be, because it's a grid system, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, right? I mean, I just did that to do it. You could always just have this go to, you know, this part of the grid or you know, this part of the grid. You do want to go ahead and try and meet cells, because that's what gives your grid its alignment. But everything doesn't have to be the same size. I just did that to do it. You know, we'll put some other things on here, like some contact info. Just to mix things up, I'm going to make a box down here. And you'll notice right now this box has a black outline, but it's transparently filled. I kind of want that reverse, so I'm going to turn off the stroke. But I am going to fill it. Oh, it's not flush. What's the problem here? Okay, so there's that. There's that. So that's, yeah, let's align. If we look at this in preview, you can kind of see. I'm just going to mix it up and put my contact info down here. And I'll put it in white. So let me go ahead and just do that really quickly. Screen mode. Same thing. So text. You know, I'll put I want to make this trebuchet. Now, if I try and put it over this, it's not going to show up because it's black text on a black background. What I do want to do is change the text color here. So I went to color and I clicked this little text thing. I'll change this to white. Seems like it disappeared, but that's just because it's on the background. I've got my grid structure here. So I could, you know, line everything up like that, or I could if I wanted to. Let's do this. Go to paragraph, right align it. And now I'll have it align along the right margin, but not necessarily the left. Right, so there's that. And let's just make sure it's fitting our grid perfectly, which it isn't exactly. So we'll do some tweaks. Right, so first, let's snap that there. Oh, actually it is. That's fortunate. You can see that it's fitting perfectly inside this. So it's left, excuse me, it's right aligned. You've got my email address there. I could add my phone number. I'm not going to do that because I'm not insane. Let's see. Scale out. Oh, I didn't add consultant. Oopsie. Now, to make this look appropriate, what I'd want to do is ensure, in fact, let me just delete this, ensure that the same little text tweaks that I put on this, they should be on the other one as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. So that's lined up. Change this to consultant. Okay, so that's that. You can see it's got a grid structure. It includes our QR code. We've got our contact info. I probably would add phone because you see how there's this white space here. And another thing I would do is, remember how I talked about making things divisible by certain things? There's a guideline called the rule of thirds, which suggests that things broken up into thirds can be visually appealing. And in fact, this black bar is covering the gutter, which I probably wouldn't necessarily want to do. We've got how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this already is thirds. I just did that naturally. This is a third of the actual height of this. That's a good rule of thumb to follow. It's just sort of something about visual work. The conventions of it suggest that things broken into thirds, and then putting important visual elements at the intersection of that grid tends to be effective. It's just a guideline, though. It's not a magic formula. So there's that. This is a quick, grid design. I'd obviously do more with this because I just sort of slapped this together. But it's just to give us an example of how this works. And keep in mind, you're not limited in terms of orientation or color or, this is one side. Why not use both sides, right? Why not use the back? So if you wanted to, and we'll just really quickly, let's say we wanted to make one with a back. So I will, and I'll do it in portrait. So the width's going to be, I'll make it 6, just that'll be 2 inches and then 2 inches in between, and then the back will be the other 2 inches. And then the height will be 3 by 5. Don't need facing pages, no gutter, no margins. Right, so now I've got this. I could pretty easily make a box that's 2 by 3.5. I'll move it in place. Right. And I'll put another one over here for the back. Oops, and I will actually copy it rather than moving it. Held the wrong button down. So these could be my front and my back, and I might put this here just so my professor knows what I'm doing here. So front and back. And I'd align these. Even though I don't really have to. And, you know, I could use color. So let's say, you know, I'll just slap something together. Let's say I wanted to put in the same kind of grid system, create guides. Let's tweak this down to the default, bump this up a bit. And now because we're dealing with the whole thing, we'll have to multiply our number of columns, right? And make sure that the math makes them hit in an appropriate place. Ooh, yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm going to use a 0. Let's do a 0.4, 0.05 for that. Well, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life futzing with this. Yeah, there we go. And I could just do something like whip up, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we could do the first 4. Oh, that's right. I did a 4th on the other one, didn't I? Not a 3rd. So this has an outline. I don't want that. I'm going to turn off the stroke. But I do want the interior. So let's make it a nice blue, right? And I'll put my name on there. Whoa. And you'll notice I'm not loosely, I'm only loosely hitting the grid because I'm just showing you some options. And I could change this to white so it shows up better. Right? JTRL, then maybe I can put another bar down here with contact info. You know what, I'd probably include the gutter. Turn off the stroke. You know what I should do is move this so it actually it's here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Copy and paste. Yeah. And then I'd move this to the grid. Now I'm not taking the time to actually hit the grid as we did before. I'm just showing you some design alternatives. So obviously, I would make this actually fit the grid. Right now, I'm just slapping this together. And you can see how this would start to work. It's pretty hideous, but you can see how we can start using color and the front and back, right? So I might actually drop in the grid back here. I'd probably want to use the same 3rd. And probably I'd want to align these. Whoa. Yeah, where is my alignment? There we go. What that means is now this is in the exact middle. I use the align panel to do that. So I could put that and, maybe put my website address right there. But these are just options, right? You can use portrait orientation. I'm going to bring this bounding bar to the front. You can use portrait orientation. You can use color. You can use both sides if you want. There's all kinds of opportunities. That's the gist of what we're looking at. We will have some time in class to actually workshop this stuff, but these are the things we're getting at, right? Let me go back to my cheesy presentation. working inside of a limited design space. It's a small document, so how do we design effectively in there? It's largely text-driven, although, of course, and we didn't look at this, you could bring in decoration graphics. We'll look at some samples in class that are highly visual, but text is probably an important part of this. Probably, not necessarily, but probably. Using grid design techniques, on that first example, I was pretty strictly grid-driven. The second one, I was just kind of slopping it together, but I would go back and tidy that up. It, again, takes care of things like alignment, similarity. It creates order, these kinds of things. And then lastly, we're working on incorporating this QR code. These are the things we're focusing on. We're going to get some practice doing that. If you have any questions, you can always contact me via email. But I think that's it. All right, I will see you guys later.